Good morning. I'm Dorine Winkler, and I'm the acting chair of the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act Alliance. That's a bit of a mouthful, so I'm going to say the AODA Alliance from now on. The AODA Alliance is a voluntary, nonpartisan grassroots coalition of both individuals and organizations. The mission of the AODA Alliance is to contribute to the achievement of a barrier-free Ontario for all persons with disabilities by promoting and supporting the timely, effective, and comprehensive implementation of the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act. Our coalition is the successor to the Ontarians with Disabilities Act Committee, the AODA Committee. As many of you are aware, the AODA Committee advocated for over 10 years for the enactment of strong, effective disability accessibility legislation. The AODA Coalition's members are drawn mainly from the broad grassroots base of the AODA Committee. I want now to introduce David Lepofsky on my right. David is a very active member of our coalition, and he led the decade-long campaign to get the Disability Act passed. More recently, he is known for winning 2 successive human rights cases against the Toronto Transit Commission. The first was to force the TTC to consistently announce all subway stops. And the second was to get the TTC to announce all bus and streetcar stops for the benefit of blind and visually impaired people. Also, you heard the new Lieutenant Governor mention David in his swearing-in speech on Wednesday. On my left is Ms. Leslie MacDonald, who is the National Accessibility Coordinator for the Canadian National Institute for the Blind. She's a member of our coalition as well. The Ontario government appointed her to serve on a committee charged with the development of accessibility standards for public transportation under the Disability Act. Now, David will present our message to you this morning, and we are available to answer questions afterwards. Because David and I will not be able to see you, we would appreciate it if you would just state your name and the news organization you're with before you ask the question. Thank you. David?
Good morning, everybody. 2 days ago in this building, the new Lieutenant Governor, David Onley, made an inspiring speech in which he committed our province to achieve what it can to become fully accessible. And he challenged each and every Ontarian to do what they could to get us to that goal of full accessibility. It's an important goal. Over 1.5 million of us now have a disability. Age is the most common cause of disability, and our society is getting older. So our numbers will grow. In fact, disability touches everybody's life because everyone either has a disability now or will get one eventually. So his challenge affects and concerns all of us. We have come here today to ask what the 3 political parties will do to take up that challenge. They are in the best position to lead Ontario to the goal of full accessibility. What we would like to do is to tell you what the problem is, what we've proposed for a solution, what the 3 parties have committed or not committed, and finally, how we propose to tackle this during this upcoming election. In doing this, I have to emphasize, as Dorine said, that we are a non-partisan coalition. We're not here to try to get any particular party or any particular individual elected. We will try to be fair in our description of the strengths and weaknesses of each of the parties' positions. And at this news conference, we can unveil to you the election commitments of 2 of the 3 parties, the 2 who have answered our call. More on that in just a couple of minutes. So what's the problem? Put simply, we live in a province full of too many barriers that impede people with physical or mental or sensory disabilities from fully participating in jobs and access to the goods and services and facilities that we all enjoy. whether our disability is physical or mental or sensory, whether it's visible or invisible, whether we're old or young. These barriers hurt all of us. Our goal is a fully accessible, barrier-free province. We campaigned for over a decade to get a new, strong Disability Act that would achieve our goal. And that law was passed with the unanimous support of the legislature 2 years ago. So what's the problem? The problem comes up on two fronts. First, the implementation of the Disability Act. Since we celebrated its enactment 2 years ago, we regret that the current government has done a very troublingly ineffective job of implementing the law. The law requires the government to get us to a fully accessible province within what was then 20 years, what is now less than 18. To do that, it was required to make strong and effective accessibility standards that would tell sectors of our economy what they need to do and when they need to do it by. And it was to be enforceable. Well, the government's only enacted one accessibility standard since then to deal with customer service. It's only about 8 pages long, and it's very, very weak. The government has a second proposed standard on the table. It's got it out for public consultation. It deals with the important service of access to public transportation. You can't get a job if you can't get to the interview. Well, let me tell you how weak, how ineffective, and how troubling that proposed transportation standard is. As you heard, I fought 2 long and hard battles against the Toronto Transit Commission to get them to first provide announcements of subway stops and then more recently bus stops, so we blind folks, and frankly all other passengers, can know when we've gotten to our destination. When I won my human rights case earlier this summer to force the TTC to announce bus stops, the Human Rights Tribunal ruled that the TTC had 30 days to start providing consistent announcements of all bus stops. The McGuinty government's proposed transportation accessibility standard would give other cities, other municipal transit providers, 18 years before they would have to provide the same accommodation. We find that that standard in that area is utterly weak, ineffective, and unacceptable. And that's to deal with something as simple as low cost, as easy and obvious as having bus drivers say what the next stop is. The transportation standard is as flawed when it deals with other more challenging issues in making our transit system accessibility. Don't take our word from it, though. The Ontario Human Rights Commission has publicly announced that in its view, the proposed transportation standard is not only weak and ineffective, but falls markedly below the requirements of the Ontario Human Rights Code, and in some ways could actually delay or make things worse. In the materials available to you this morning is the news release of the Human Rights Commission on the proposed McGuinty government's transportation standard. What we need is for the government's implementation of the Accessibility Act that we won to be dramatically reformed so the standards for accessibility that we get are strong and effective, not weak and ineffective. As a result of the transportation standard that we've been talking about, just as one illustration, we folks with disabilities are now, to get our rights enforced, going to have to file individual human rights complaints against each and every municipal transit provider in Ontario, just to win for blind folks outside Toronto what I won for them in Toronto. The Disability Act was passed so that we wouldn't have to fight barriers one at a time, so that we'd get strong and effective standards that would set the appropriate standard for the whole province and that would relieve us of the obligation of having to fight these one case at a time. In that way, the implementation by the government of the Disability Act so far has been a dramatic flop. But that's only the first front. Let me tell you about the second front we face. Up until now, we've had the opportunity and, in fact, the legal right, if we feel that we are the victims of discrimination, to go to a public law enforcement agency, the Human Rights Commission, to file a human rights complaint, and we've had the right to have it publicly investigated and, where the evidence supports it, publicly prosecuted by the Human Rights Commission. I told you just a few moments ago that because of the McGuinty government's proposed weak transit standard, we would have to do that all over the province. But here's the double whammy we've faced. The McGuinty government just 2 weeks ago proclaimed the start date for its widely condemned Bill 107. Bill 107 takes away from us the right to have the Human Rights Commission publicly investigate and, where appropriate, publicly prosecute discrimination cases. After the McGuinty government privatized human rights enforcement, we're going to have to investigate those cases ourselves. We're going to have to find our own lawyer. I was fortunate. I am a lawyer, but most people with disabilities don't suffer from that double disability. We're going to have to investigate our own cases and find our own lawyer. Now, the McGuinty government last year promised that, under their new law, they were going to guarantee a free lawyer for every discrimination victim, but their bill doesn't provide that. So we face the specter of having to prosecute cases ourselves. What are we up against? Well, the Toronto Star, when I won my case, reported that the TTC spent between $100,000 and $200,000 fighting me just to get bus stops announced. So that's what we're up against. The government announced a new Human Rights Legal Support Center and proudly proclaimed that it would meet our needs. But its budget is a mere 25% of the budget that the Human Rights Commission traditionally got. Traditionally, the Human Rights Commission got in the range of $12 million per year. The McGuinty government's spring budget this year, I was at the lockup, committed only $3 million a year. There is no way that that clinic is going to be able to provide free lawyers for all discrimination victims. So on the one hand, the Disability Act's weak implementation piles on us the need to fight barriers one at a time. And on the other hand, we face a human rights system that now has taken away our public investigator and our public prosecutor. Yes, the Human Rights Commission can launch their own cases, but their power to do that's actually been reduced, contrary to what Barbara Hall claimed in a letter to the Toronto Star this morning. So what do you do about it? We believe that our role should not be just to criticize, but to support government and to offer constructive solutions. So 2 weeks ago, we wrote all three party leaders in the spirit of nonpartisanship a letter back on August 24th setting forth a list of practical suggestions of what we said ought to be done and asked for their commitments. Their answer to that letter, I believe, reflects how seriously they're prepared to act on the challenge that David Onley gave all of us when he was sworn in 2 days ago. The copy of our letter to Mr. McGuinty is on the available to you here. Identically worded letters were sent at the time to Mr. Hampton and to Mr. Torrey. What have we proposed? The letter explains it in detail, but I'll summarize it as this. We ask two things. First, we ask that the implementation of the unanimously passed Disability Act be strengthened, the process for developing accessibility standards be made fairer, more open, and more accessible so that the standards they produce are strong and effective as promised, not weak and troubling. That's what's been delivered. If you want to know more about the problems that have happened at the standards development table that have led to this mess, we have at the table Ms. Leslie McDonald, and you can ask her questions after. She sat on the Transportation Standards Committee as one of the disability representatives and tried to get a stronger transit standard provided, but she could tell you how the disability sector was outgunned, in effect, by the government and transit sector representatives who outnumbered them, out-resourced them, and ultimately generated a standard that we all found completely unacceptable, which is now out for public comment and possible adoption by government. So we proposed, based on what we've learned, some very practical steps to ensure, for example, equal representation by people with disabilities at the table. If you're going to make a standard that affects us, please don't make us a minority where we're going to always be outvoted. We want those meetings to be, the standards development process to be open and to be based on consultations with the public. If you can believe it, as one example, I wrote the Transportation Standards Committee as an individual a year ago and said, could I come and present to you on why I think you should require all transit providers to provide as simple an accommodation as announcing all bus stops. I was refused even the opportunity as a member of the disability community to go to their meeting and present my concerns in person. We need a more open process. So our first proposal is to strengthen the process for implementing the Disability Act. Our second proposal is that the government's widely criticized privatization of the human rights enforcement process has to be stopped, reversed, and replaced by a fair and open consultation leading to a strengthening of a public enforcement system of our human rights by a strengthened, better funded Human Rights Commission. So what have the parties done and what have the parties said? Let me give you in a nutshell what we've heard. We have gotten responses to our requests from John Tory for the PC Party and Howard Hampton for the NDP. We have received no response from the governing Liberals, and it isn't because we didn't try very hard to get callbacks and to get an answer. What are their position? What is their record, and what are their positions as best we can tell right now? First, the Liberals. The Liberals, to their credit, passed the strong Disability Act we asked for and consulted with us before developing it, as they said they would. That law was passed, as I said, in 2005. And we're very much indebted to them for doing that. However, since then, the Liberals' record becomes more troubling. First, the problem I've already highlighted, that once they passed it, their implementation of it has been a huge step backwards. Next, the Liberal government brought in Bill 107 to privatize human rights enforcement. We say that was actually a breach of their commitment to us during the development of the Disability Act regarding the ongoing availability of the Human Rights Commission to investigate and prosecute human rights cases. By the way, I've made that allegation at this desk at news conference after news conference, and not one Liberal representative has ever come public to deny my statement that they gave us that commitment when we were developing the Disability Act. The Liberal government promised consultations, public hearings for all before the Legislature, before they passed Bill 107. What did they actually do? When the hearings started turning against Bill 107, they invoked closure to muzzle their critics, including us. The Liberal government promised free lawyers for all. What did they deliver? They delivered a Human Rights Legal Support Center that will be given the de facto power to decide who gets a lawyer and who doesn't. The Liberal government promised that they would consult after the bill was passed on its implementation. Well, with no fanfare and no public celebration, they proclaimed the law 2 weeks ago to take effect next summer, and the McGuinty government has still not held an open, accessible public consultation. They've had some ad hoc events by some players in the human rights system, but nothing coordinated, nothing systematic, and certainly nowhere near enough needed before this bill was ready for proclamation. Let's turn to the PC Party. What's been their, with respect to the Liberal Party, what have they committed? In their election platform released yesterday, there are no commitments on any of the issues that I've been discussing this morning, and there's no letter to us responding to our requests that we've placed before you. We still hope we will get something before the election is underway and certainly before it's done, but so far we have no word from them at all. This is, by the way, the first election in 4 that the Ontario Liberal Party has not made some kind of commitment to us with respect to the issues of advancing the agenda of disability equality. We had commitments in the 1995, 1999, and 2003 elections. This is the first where we can't get a response. The PC Party. The PC Party, under John Tory's leadership, supported and voted for the passage of the Disability Act in 2005. That involved supporting the passage of legislation which was stronger than the legislation that the prior Harris PCs was prepared to bring forward before the legislature. And for that we are appreciative that they have taken this new policy position in support of a strong mandatory disability accessibility law. Since then, the Tory PCs have supported our concerns about Bill 107, the privatization of human rights, and they proposed a series of amendments to strengthen that bill and remove its most troubling elements. A year ago, when that bill was before the legislature, the government voted them all down. John Tory, in a letter to us that's on the table here and which we've just received, has made a series of commitments to us. With respect to Bill 107, he has committed, as we have requested, to replace that bill, to remove it and replace Bill 107 with a new system that will restore the public enforcement system, to increase funding to it, and to undertake a proper open consultation, the key things we've asked for. With respect to strengthening the implementation of the Disability Act, you'll see in his letter that he's answered each of our inquiries and has committed to the direction that we've sought. In some cases, he's committed to the specific actions we've asked, and in others, he's committed to explore with us and with his government, if elected, the steps needed to pursue our objectives. Let me talk now about the Howard Hampton NDP. To their credit, the Howard Hampton NDP have supported strong disability legislation throughout our fight since we were formed, and particularly since the 1995 election and beyond. While they were in government in the early 90s, this is ancient history, a private member's bill was allowed to go to second reading, but that died on the order paper when the 1995 election was called. The Howard Hampton NDP supported the Disability Act and called, in fact, for it to be strengthened. The NDP supported all of our concerns on Bill 107, voted against Bill 107, as did the PCs, voted against closure where the government tried to muzzle us, and proposed amendments to Bill 107 to meet our concerns, again, all of which the McGuinty Liberals defeated. The NDP have also, like John Tory, responded to our letter of 2 weeks ago. They have made comparable commitments with respect to the repeal of Bill 107 and the replacement of it with a strengthened human rights commission process for public investigation and public enforcement of human rights, rather than privatized human rights enforcement, the McGuinty agenda. The NDP, in their letter to us of yesterday's date that's available on the table, also commit to each and every specific step we've asked be taken to strengthen the implementation of the Disability Act. So, where do we go from here? We are a community-based group. We can't run big, fancy TV ads throughout the election like some others can, but we can do something that is very, very important. We can reach a lot of people. We've done it in 3 successive elections and many by-elections in between. Our major way to get the message out to the public about these issues, to let voters know about our concerns and the positions of the parties, is through the media, through radio call-in shows, through all candidates debate, through the all-powerful internet, which reaches thousands and thousands and thousands of people, and through word of mouth. We've done it before, and we're going to do it again. This is a very close election. This is an election that pundits suggest is looking towards a minority government and where there are going to be a whole series of close races. There are really 2 election campaigns that go on. There's the one that you'll read about in the papers and hear about on the weekly shows that review Queen's Park politics. They'll focus on leadership and the couple of big headline-grabbing issues like health care or or education or whatever, and of course the horse race. But then there's the second election campaign, the one that may not show up on all the headlines all the time, the one that takes place at the kitchen table, the one that takes place at the doorstep when a candidate knocks on the door, the one that takes place as people think about how they want to vote. Voters think about a whole wide range of issues, and we've learned through the past 3 elections and many by-elections in between that every vote and every voter counts, and that many, many are concerned about the very concerns we are raising, whether or not they show up day after day as one of the 2 or 3 core issues that are the focus of lead coverage. We're going to be out there. Let me conclude where I began. We were all given a challenge 2 days ago by our new and inspiring Lieutenant Governor. We, as a community-based coalition, have tried in a spirit of nonpartisanship to offer a constructive agenda that we hope all the parties will buy into, so that whatever be the shape and the makeup of the legislature, we will be able to advance our agenda. Whether a particular government is one party or another, whether it's a majority or a minority, our intention is to work with all the parties to try to get our 2 core aims advanced in the upcoming election. And with that, we'd be delighted to take your questions, if there are any.
Pam Seidel from City TV here. We've met before, David.
Yes.
Nice to see you again. My question is about the Act when it was implemented. Was it not clear from the beginning that it was going to take 20 years in order to achieve this goal? Is it just the sort of the individual components, like something like announcing at bus stops would be very easy to do and should be done right away? But presumably it's understandable that it would take years. 20 years sounds fairly reasonable to me if we are, to achieve a fully accessible province.
Your answer is absolutely correct, and that was the underlying design. What we were hoping is that the standards development committees that we were involved in advocating for when we were involved in proposing how this legislation should be designed, that they would get a fair representation from, for example, transit providers and the disability community, and they'd haggle this stuff out, and there would be some compromise that would have to be drawn, and that certain action could be taken quickly, things that could be done at low or no cost, or that could be done quickly just as a matter of practicality, and other things that would take longer but would get accomplished along reasonable timelines. The government's commitment, the McGuinty government's commitment that all 3 parties bought into in a resolution that we actually got the House to pass 9 years ago, was to achieve a fully accessible province as soon as reasonably possible. That doesn't mean overnight. So we understand that. The problem is the way the government has implemented this. It looks like, for example, the transit providers were running the show. So if you look at their proposed transportation standard, it's an agenda for how long can we delay as much as possible and how little can we have to do. And that's where the problem is. We knew there would be compromises, and we knew everything wouldn't happen overnight. But when you're outnumbered, when at the other side of the table are a bunch of folks who are supported by organizations who are paid for by the taxpayer in many cases and who can marshal all the legal and other resources to mount their case, and when the government doesn't show the appropriate leadership in steering it, there would be a problem. Here's like a core illustration of what I mean. The aim of these standards is to implement the requirements of the Human Rights Code. It's already the law, but we shouldn't have to go fighting over these accommodations, like calling bus stops, to get what the law entitles us to. These standards that they've proposed so far, and particularly this proposed transit standard, fall way below the requirements of the Human Rights Code. In other words, they didn't do their job. Don't take my word for it. Take the word of the Human Rights Commission, because they've put that on the record publicly in a news release, a copy of which is available to you here. By the way, the government might say to you, well, it's only a proposed draft, and this is a chance for public input. In we proposing this legislation, we never in a million years thought that we would face proposed standards that were so bad that we'd have to be out there fighting against them. If anything, we were contemplating at this point that they'd come out with proposed standards that, okay, if they didn't do it in 5 years, maybe 4 years for some things, if bus stops weren't required in 30 days, maybe a year, but one way, and then we would either squabble about the amount of time in between, or just draw us off, and that's the usual compromise process. And you'd eventually get where you need to get to, sometimes quicker than you'd like, sometimes slower than you like, would work out. What we did not expect, we thought that at this point we'd be talking about tweaking a good proposal. What we're doing instead now is organizing people with disabilities to go out riding by riding to get support to stop this thing, because if it goes through as proposed or anywhere near like it's proposed, it's going to be a huge setback for us. Yes.
Philip Lee Shannock, CBC Radio.
Sure.
So you've canvassed the three parties, and two of them gave you responses that you were agreeable with. Are you saying that the incumbent government, the incumbents, are you urging your supporters and your people that you know to vote against the incumbent?
We don't recommend, in the spirit of nonpartisanship, we have never told anybody or suggested to anybody how they should vote. What we are going to do is encourage, we're going to keep up, hopefully working, applying pressure to try to get a commitment from the McGuinty government, and even if they don't commit on some things, look, they think Bill 107 is great, though they don't think it's so great that they don't mention it in their list of their accomplishments that they put in their platform. Actually, ironically, they don't even mention in their platform released yesterday the Disability Act. You would have thought they would say, hey, look at one of the things we've accomplished. The Lieutenant Governor talked very proudly about that accomplishment 2 days ago, but the governing Liberals didn't, and we say they deserve credit for passing it, but they seem to be running from it at this point. I don't understand why. What we will do is we'll do what we've done over a decade, which is also to bring our message out riding by riding, because even if the leader of the Liberal Party won't answer us, if we can get Liberal candidates to commit to these things, then that can help work towards the position we want. Also, if there's a minority government elected next time, whoever's in power, they're going to need the support of a majority of votes in the House to do things. And if we've got a majority of MPPs, either from parties that have committed to us or individuals that have committed to us on this agenda, then we'll be able to come forward after the election and work on trying to get our agenda advanced that way. And that's why this issue is especially important in a close election like this one. Other questions? Sorry, go ahead.
Is there any chance, what are the chances that the Bill 107 would be rescinded at this point?
Well, according to the commitments we've now gotten from John Tory and Howard Hampton, we know this. If either of them were elected premier, they've made commitments to rescind it. If either of them elected premier and there's a minority government, we now have majority votes between the two parties for its repeal. If the McGuinty government were reelected but in a minority position, we do have a majority of opposition seats, and we will be in a position to look to see what can be done that way to advance that agenda. So, obviously the McGuinty government's committed to Bill 107, and but on the other hand, they may also, depending how the election unfolds in the next 4 weeks, decide that if there's enough concern about this, it might be worth taking a sober second look at it rather than rushing to implement it as they've been doing up to now. They rushed the proclamation through cabinet before the election was called, even though the start date is until next summer. Well, remember, they closed down the hearings. They muzzled us last December because they were in such a hurry to pass this thing. Mind you, a year and a half, they've now set a start date for it to go into effect for a year and a half later. That shows they did not have to shut down the hearings at all a year ago.
So presumably it's to save money? Is this a cost-cutting thing?
Why are they doing it? It's sort of hard to be in the position to explain why they're doing something that they think is good and we think is not. They think it's going to speed up the process. They think that it's going to remove the backlog. We say it's going to move the backlog from the lineup at the Human Rights Commission to the lineup at the Human Rights Tribunal. It's going to move the lineup to from a human rights commission that had $12 million to investigate and litigate cases to a legal clinic that's only got $3 million. What's that going to do for the lineup? The only way to shorten that lineup is just tell people go away. And we say that's wrong. Now, we also say this is all contrary to their commitment that everybody's going to get a free independent legal counsel. And you'll see a link on our material there where you can read the promises they made. They're up on our website. They're quoted from Hansard. I'm not. They said it. We didn't, and we're just quoting them. But we share the government's view that the human rights process was backlogged, was too slow, and that wasn't fair to discrimination victims. In fact, all three parties agree with that. We think the solution is worse and will make things worse. The government said that by bringing this forward, they would empower discrimination victims and they'd guarantee everybody a hearing. But the reality is, if you don't have a lawyer and you're up against, for example, the TTC, who can spend between what the Star says $100,000 and $200,000 on a very effective lawyer to throw every last legal argument at you can. Believe me, it's not fun. I've been there. I've been there twice. I've been cross-examined twice. I know what it's like to have to go through this process. You need legal support to be able to do this. And if the government seems to think that either people are going to be able to do it on their own, which they're not, they seem to think that they've removed any gatekeeper, that you'll have a right to go right to the tribunal. Well, that's great if you got a lawyer. It's really bad if you don't. Any other questions?
Other than sort of being inspiring and an inspiring symbol, is there anything else you're expecting from the new Lieutenant Governor?
Well, he just took office 2 days ago. I think that his message is a strong and important one. I think there's several things that are going to happen with David Onley's appointment. One of which is anybody who wants him to speak, they better have an accessible place for him to speak, right? He's going to be a trailblazer not only in the spiritual or symbolic sense, but in the very physical sense. But it's too early now. Obviously, he can't wade into an election, nor does he purport to. But he can lay down the gauntlet, and I think now that he has done that, voters can look to each of the three parties and see what they're prepared to do to pick up and run with that challenge.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.